Welcome to the Canadian Journalist, reporting November 10th, 2023. The lead story, "Don't call it a ceasefire," in quotation marks. Reports show that the amount of Palestinians killed has now topped 10,000, 40% of them children. Thousands are still missing. The United Nations warns that Gaza is, quote, "becoming a graveyard for children," end quote. The White House admitted during a press conference yesterday that Israel has killed, quote, many thousands of innocent people," end quote. Here we have press.unitednations.org. Gaza becoming a graveyard for children, warns Secretary General, calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. Following our UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' remarks at a press conference on the situation in the Middle East in New York today. The nightmare in Gaza is more than a humanitarian crisis. It is a crisis of humanity. The intensifying conflict is shaking the world, rattling the region, and most tragically destroying so many innocent lives. Ground operations by the Israeli Defense Forces and continued bombardment are hitting civilians, hospitals, refugee camps, mosques, churches, and UN facilities, including shelters. No one is safe. At the same time, Hamas and other militants use civilians as human shields and continue to launch rockets indiscriminately towards Israel. I reiterate my utter condemnation of the abhorrent acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th and repeat my call for the immediate, unconditional, and safe release of hostages held in Gaza. Nothing can justify the deliberate torture, killing, injuring, and kidnapping of civilians. The protection of civilians must be paramount. I am deeply concerned about clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing. Let me be clear, no party to an armed conflict is above international humanitarian law. Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children. Hundreds of girls and boys are reportedly being killed or injured every day. More journalists have reportedly been killed over a 4-week period than in any conflict in at least 3 decades. More United Nations aid workers have been killed than in any comparable period in the history of the organization. Let me sidebar. That last few statements really nail it home. Not just the hundreds of girls and boys are being killed, but the fact that journalists have been killed more over a 4-week period than in any conflict in the last 30 years, 3 decades, and United Nations aid workers have been killed in comparable period in the history of the organization. That's really saying something, guys. Which means that the bombs are not, they are just wide open cluster bombs, no targeting system, no specific targets whatsoever. It is just kill everybody down there. I salute all those who continue their life-saving work despite the overwhelming challenges and risks. The unfolding catastrophe makes the need for humanitarian ceasefire more urgent with every passing hour. The parties to the conflict, and indeed the international community, face an immediate and fundamental responsibility to stop the inhuman collective suffering and dramatically expand humanitarian aid to Gaza. Today, the UN and our partners are launching $1.2 billion humanitarian appeal to help 2.7 million people. That's the entire population of the Gaza Strip and 500,000 Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Some life-saving aid is getting into Gaza from Egypt through the Rafah crossing, but the trickle of assistance does not meet the ocean of need. Let's be clear, the Rafah crossing alone does not have the capacity to process aid trucks at the scale required. Just over 400 trucks have crossed into Gaza over the past 2 weeks, compared with 500 a day before the conflict. And crucially, this does not include fuel. Without fuel, newborn babies in incubators and patients on life support will die. Water cannot be pumped or purified. Raw sewage could soon start gushing onto the streets, further spreading disease. Trucks loaded with critical relief will be stranded. The way forward is clear: a humanitarian ceasefire now. Moving on to news.antiwar.com. The White House acknowledged on Monday that the U.S.-backed Israeli onslaught on Gaza has killed many thousands of innocent people as the Biden administration continues unconditional support for Israel's war. The comments were made by White House National Security Council spokesman, Mr. John Kirby. John Kirby, the same one that said on camera, "We do not have chemical weapons in Ukraine," only to have Victoria Nuland say, like, later on, "Well, we do have chemical facilities, biological facilities in Ukraine, and we're really worried that the Russians will get a hold of this information in these facilities." Continuing, Gaza's health minister said on Tuesday that at least 10,328 Palestinians have been killed, including 4,237 children. Thousands more are missing and presumed to be under the rubble. The Biden administration has cast doubt on the numbers coming from Gaza's health ministry, but is not denying civilians are being killed on a massive scale. Moving on, despite the grim death toll, the U.S. still refuses to place any limits on Israel's use of American weapons. "We don't put conditions on weapons that we're sending or that Israel is using." Back to my main story. So the UN called for a humanitarian ceasefire, but they are among the few Western organizations to use that word. In a joint statement by representatives of the G7, which includes our Trudeau, leaders avoided that word, but did call for humanitarian pauses. The word ceasefire has become politicized, so politicians are asking for a ceasefire without asking for it. On Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that a ceasefire would be a surrender to Hamas. That is how they are shutting down this call for peace. Now, politicians who want to prevent the civilian deaths in Gaza are dancing around the word. Take Senator Bernie Sanders, who seems to have just woken up and decided to speak for peace again after basically sleeping through the war in Ukraine since 2022. He released a statement calling for the innocent killings to stop and says that the U.S. has a say here. Quote, "It is no great secret that the United States provides $3.8 billion every year to Israel." But he doesn't use the term ceasefire. The United Nations is also calling for the unconditional release of the hostages in Gaza now. Yes, both things unconditionally. This is the Canadian Journalist. Thanks for paying attention.